2 years ago this week, my husband received a message on Facebook. It was from my sister. She wasn't able to call me because I live in the UK, but she had some news she had to tell me, and she didn't want me to find this out by email or text message, so she sent a message to him and have him tell me. I was in the bedroom, probably packing or unpacking from a work trip, when my husband walked in, and I could tell immediately that something was wrong. He took a breath and told me that my mother had passed away. He held me and was the first of very many people to tell me how sorry he was for my loss. I cried, but really I was just numb. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. There was a misunderstanding, a mistake. My mother was a survivor from a family of survivors. Born in 1940 in Minnesota, with its harsh winters and muggy and mosquito-filled summers. The family was poor. It was the Great Depression still lingering, and the U.S. was still about a year or so away from getting into World War II. As a child, she spent years in a succession of foster homes, one after the other. My grandmother was in a sanatorium for tuberculosis, and my grandfather struggled with alcohol, so he couldn't take care of the children. She told me over the years how hard it was to get pulled away from your family so young, but it was also hard when, eventually, several years later, they were reunited. By that point, she barely knew some of her siblings. The family moved frequently, probably looking for a better or more stable life, and in the mid-1950s, they were living in Southern California. It was there that my parents met in Long Beach. They eloped when my mother was about 15 years old. Dad was 23. They told my grandparents that they were going to go to San Juan Capistrano to watch the Swallows return, but really they were going to Tijuana to get married. When they returned, they somehow convinced my grandparents not to have the marriage annulled. Their first child was born the following year, and two more followed: Teddy, Ruth, and Robert. And then tragedy. One afternoon, my mother was visiting a friend, and the last thing she could ever remember about that day was pulling out of the driveway to head home. The rest of the day, mercifully, was always blanked out of her memory. No one knows exactly how it happened, but there was a car accident, a collision, head-on. My mother always thought that she must have been distracted by the children. Maybe Ruthie had another bloody nose. Something. No one was wearing seatbelts. It was 1959, and that wasn't really a thing then. By all accounts, the two boys died instantly. Ruthie survived for a few hours, but her injuries, particularly to her brain, were too severe. My mother was unconscious for days. When she woke up, she asked to see the children. My dad had to lie to her, to tell her the children were just fine. The hospital just couldn't let them in because of her condition. They couldn't let the children see her in that state. The doctors had told him that if he didn't lie, she was bad enough that she was just going to give up and she would die as well. She knew the truth, and she pushed him again and again to tell her, but he just had to keep denying it, even though it was killing him inside. He had just lost his children as well. In the months that followed, my mother endured a series of surgeries to rebuild her face, and she bore the scars, both the physical and the emotional ones, for the rest of her life. A couple years later, in 1962, my eldest living sister was born. In 1963, another pregnancy ended in tragedy as they lost Roberta after just a few hours. In 1964, my eldest living brother was born, and then, in '66, me. I broke the mold. In the decade after that car accident, my parents drifted. They never really dealt with the accident or with their loss. Instead, they just started to drink heavily and tried to forget. My dad got violent. One day in 1970, while he was at work, my mother packed everything she could into the car, got us kids in the car, and left him. They had separated before, but they'd always got back together. But this time, she was convinced that if she didn't leave him, he was going to kill her. This time it was over. But my mother had never really been on her own. She'd gone directly from foster homes back to her parents, then directly into my dad. Now, at 30 years old, was the first time she was on her own, and she was lost. She stumbled onto the first of several more marriages, tumultuous things, getting together, separating, back together, separating over and over for years before finally moving on to the next one. But she had her demons, and she could never stand to be alone. She always needed someone in her life like that, a romantic partner. And she could never stop running, trying to get away from or get to something that she couldn't explain. And I've talked in another video before about how we moved constantly when I was growing up. In winter 1980, she was married to her third husband, a Vietnam veteran who struggled with his memories of the war. We were living in Hill City, Minnesota. I was 13 years old. One night, she had arranged a Tupperware party with her friends. She told my stepfather that it was girls' night and he'd agreed to go out earlier in the day. When the time came, however, he was tired or whatever and didn't want to leave. They argued and she insisted that he go, so he stormed out. He left angry and went out to drink, and get angrier and angrier. When he came home, a fight, which escalated. I was in my room reading, and fights between them weren't uncommon, so first I just ignored it. After a while, though, my sister came into the room and told me, "You need to get out of here." You need to get out of the house." From my open door, I could see into the front room, and I could see that my stepfather had a rifle. And he and my mother and some other people were struggling over the gun and bullets. I remember him pulling the butt of the rifle back and hitting it into her face, but no one else remembered that happening, so maybe that's just a memory I've created. I wanted to try to help, but my sister said, "No, Mom won't leave the house until we're all out. You need to go now." She had me climb out the window, in pajamas I think, and run across a cold Minnesota field to our nearest neighbor. My brother was already there. He had been sent to call the police when my stepfather ripped our phone off the wall. Time passed. I don't know how long it was. 10 minutes, 15, more, less. I really don't know. It just felt like forever to me. Not knowing what happened, what was going on. Then, finally, my sister arrived, and my mother. My mother hadn't believed that I was actually out of the house and was refusing to leave until my sister finally was able to convince her. That night, my stepfather had a standoff with police. He finally came out of the house a bit before dawn when they used tear gas. They told my mother later that had he not come out then, they would have had to go in shooting, because otherwise he would have been in a position to pick them off from inside the building shooting out. He was headed for prison, the marriage was over, and that spring my grandfather arrived to take us back to Oregon where he lived at the time. My mother still had her demons though, and she didn't want to be alone. Still always moving, never staying still. A year or so later, my sister didn't move with us when we moved to Nevada. Less than a year later, I moved in with a Mormon family when my mother moved. And then the next time my mother moved, my brother moved in with a Christian evangelical family. Our family had been shattered and scattered, and my mother kept running. I know she was hurt losing us all that quickly, even though every parent knows their children are eventually going to move, but I think she felt abandoned, even though she was one leaving and moving. I would visit her each summer when the school year let out, maybe Idaho one summer and Oregon the next, or California, or wherever she was at that moment. When I graduated from high school, I went on to college, and would have left home at that point anyway. As the years passed, her health troubles kept mounting. She'd always struggled with her weight. She became diabetic, developed high blood pressure, kidney troubles. At one point she fell off a ladder and shattered her wrist, and so on. But every time she got sick or injured, she would bounce back. I think it was about 2009 or 2010 when she started having troubles with her liver. I was living on the East Coast in Baltimore at the time, so I didn't see it when it started. At first, she just seemed to have these little moments, blackouts maybe, or maybe when she just didn't seem to think clearly, but it was quick and would pass. Like the time when she crashed her car in her mailbox and then drove home without reporting it. But then it got worse, and the moments started coming more frequently and they would last longer. At its worst, it was like a form of dementia. The ammonia level in her blood would skyrocket, and that interfered with her brain's functioning. She couldn't remember her own name or our names, if she even had kids or where she lived or anything. She would be taken to the hospital, and they would flush out her system, reduce the ammonia in her blood, and she would recover. Mostly. Each time she had an episode, she was doing a little damage to her body and a little damage to her mind. Each time she recovered, she didn't bounce back quite as far, but she did bounce back. She always bounced back. In 2012, she came to my husband and my wedding in Washington, D.C., and she had an episode the day after the wedding. When I took her to the hospital, I asked the doctor what the prognosis was. He said she probably had a couple years, maybe 3 or so, which in the end turned out to be prophetic. But she bounced back, as always, and I tried to put what he'd said out of my head. The last time I saw my mother was in October 2015. The family got together for her 75th birthday in Salem, Oregon. It was the first time that my brother, sister, and I had been together with Mom for several years. She wasn't looking good, but she always bounced back. That's just the way it was. On my last day, I was in a hurry. I wanted to get to Portland and my hotel for the night. I needed to return my rental car, get to the hotel, get some rest before my flight. She wanted me to stay, to sit with her and talk. I did for a while, but she wasn't really talking. She was having a hard time keeping her thoughts together and thinking clearly. And eventually I told her that I had to go. After all, she was going to bounce back. She always bounced back. I went to Portland, and as I said, I think my flight back to the UK was the next day. It was just a month after that visit when my sister sent that message to my husband. And I have never forgiven myself for not staying with Mom that afternoon. And every day I wish I could just see her again. Just hear her voice. Just sit with her and talk. Or even just sit with her and keep her company if she wasn't able to talk. Anything to tell her how important she was to me and to make sure she knew she was loved. Always.